how's it going, everybody? Welcome back to part 2 of the full hydrographics and automotive painting somewhat training, I guess I'm going to call this. In part 1 we covered basically all the hydrographics. In part 1 I covered mainly troubleshooting problems with your paint. So when you're having issues with things that might show up in your finished product pertaining to paint, we covered that all in part 1. So if you need to go back to that or review it, or you possibly missed that and ended up at this video instead, I would highly encourage you to go back and look through it. It's death by PowerPoint. I am so sorry, but it's the only way that I feel that I can convey the information out there in somewhat of an organized format that's easy to understand for folks. In part 2 of this video, we're going to cover the paint procedure. And these are specifically the procedures I would take to do general painting in preparation for hydrographics. Now, this is going to vary among all the various painters out there, so for you experienced guys, don't beat me up. I've only done this for about 3 or 4 years. I used to work in my dad's body shop when I was a kid, so I've been around painting for a while, but I'm no master pro. It's what I do. And, you know, I'm no like master pro painter, you know, doing West Coast customs cars or anything, nor do I proclaim to be. But I have spent the last 10 years finishing firearms, applying Cerakote, applying paint, doing all this fun stuff. So I want to share this knowledge with you. This is just basic knowledge. This is not going to take the place of actual hands-on experience. And the best way to get any of that experience is to get hands-on. So let's get right to it. So here I want to focus all on paint procedure. Some things to consider before you go spraying paint on whatever you're going to be painting is that all the substrates must be prepped prior to painting. All substrates must be free of grease, oils, and dirt. Consider using a Purple Power or Scotch-Brite pad to accomplish cleaning operations in the event that you have severe dirt. Say you get a golf cart body in and it's full of mud, what have you, that Purple Powder will really knock off a lot of grease and contaminants. Wipeout cleaner is also used for cleaning before and while painting. Prepping, plastics. Always use a red Scotch-Brite pad. Now, for some plastics that have not been painted, we're talking about injection molded parts. They never ever receive paint. There are various ways that you have to go about treating those to have a urethane paint adhere to them. One way to do this, especially on smaller parts, is flame treating. So flame treating would be taking a blowtorch, just something that holds MAP gas or propane gas, and taking a small torch and quickly whisking it over the substrate, not to melt it, but just to get it spot hot enough to where the mold release agents come up from the surface. And you have to do this because unpainted plastics cannot necessarily accept paint. This, of course, works great on small projects. Purple Power is just as effective. But if you have unpainted plastic that's large like a golf cart body that has never been painted before, your better bet is going to be to use Bulldog Adhesion Promoter, which is just a liquid product you spray on before you start to prime, and then you would let it sit on there for about 5 minutes, and after it's sprayed on, you would come over the top with any type of the epoxy-based sealer or your high-build primer, whatever you're going to use for a primer. You'd come over the top of that and continue your sanding operations. Bare metal. Sandblasted surface on bare metal is perfect on small parts, and for larger objects, a 400 grit DA sanding is recommended. You can go to 320, but 400 is about the best bet if you're going to use a dual-action sander. Previously painted surfaces in fair condition, the paint can actually be sanded with 220 and then work up to about 400 to 600 grit to achieve a properly prepped surface. You go a little bit higher than that, just kind of depends on what you're doing. This is just on average, and if anybody watching out there is a body guy or one of these expert hot rod painters, if you think that it should be higher, please leave your comments down below and tell me what you think. But on average, that's about what I use. But again, you can go up higher or lower, it just depends on what you're doing. Clear coat. Clear-coated surfaces should be DA sanded with 600 grit or scuffed with red Scotch-Brite till all the shine is gone. Then at this point, they can be primed and painted. So you can build up off of clear coat, but again, you have to prep the surface with some type of sandpaper or scuffing it, what have you. Fiberglass, it's best just scuff with red Scotch-Brite, and then of course cured black epoxy primer if you're using that, which is a 1-to-1 mixture with a catalyst and the base coat under, I believe it's under PPG's EPX line of epoxies. I love them. They're awesome. You just scuff with red Scotch-Brite and after about 24 hours, and that stuff works great. For substrates that contain dense or heavy scratches, a body filler must be used to level the area, because this is going to show up in your finished product, and you don't want that on there. So once cured, a body filler must be DA sanded within 120 to 180 grit to achieve a level surface. Then it is recommended, you need to move up from there and move up to your whatever the main part of the substrate is going to be outside of the repair. So if it's 400 or 600 grit, you would need to take it up from there and sand all that down. Of course, it's recommended that high bale primer be used for this application to fill any micro surfaces or what have you after your body repair using body filler. And then of course you're going to want to use some putty and kind of work up to where you get a nice clean repair. And for the most part for guns, you're not going to do this much, but when you start getting like golf cart bodies, if you're doing hydrographics on golf cart bodies or any type of power sports type bodies, you're going to get dents and scratches that you're going to have to fill with body filler. And even cups too. Some people can dent their like Yeti cups. So for priming, once all the surfaces have been prepped, blow off the substrate with air to remove large FOD particles, then use a clean microfiber rag, applying the wipeout cleaner with a spray bottle. It's best when you're doing this to use 2 rags in microfiber cloths, mind you. One is a wet one and then one is a dry one, and use them at the same time. Remember, wax on, wax off. Wear gloves as you do this, as once you're to this point of applying the wipeout, you need to be in as sterile as an environment as you can get. So just even minor oils from your hands can contaminate your work. So you want to avoid that at all costs. Once the substrate is clean, use a white tack rag after the primer is mixed just before painting. Now I prefer the surgical ones, the ones that look like little nets. There's some other ones out there that are blue, that are solid, and those tend to leave a sticky residue behind more than the little surgical ones do. Now the surgical ones can tend to leave a sticky residue behind. I've never worried about it too much unless it was a really critical job, and if it was a big mark that was on there, I'd try to wipe it up with wipeout, because I just didn't want to find out what that would do to the paint. But either way, when you're using this, it's best to take it all the way, unfold it all the way that you can until it's fully unfolded, and then crinkle it up very lightly. So you just kind of ball it up so you have this big old ball, and then just lightly wipe the surface. You don't need to press hard, just lightly drag it across the surface to where it doesn't mar or leave a sticky residue, and that should handle all of your dust issues. Now again, if you have a plastic piece that you're painting, it is best to probably use a static wipe. If you have metal, it should possibly be grounded, because you don't want any static electricity attracting dust in the air to your piece. I would do this with a tack rag after you have your paint and your gun. It's hanging on the rack in the booth and you're ready to start painting. Tack rag that thing over and then go to town painting. I would tack rag at the last minute. When painting unpainted plastics such as club cart, golf cart body, or other various plastics, you must use plastic adhesion promoter before priming. I cannot emphasize this enough. And make sure you get it, especially on the bottom of the body where you have the thickness portion of the body. So you have the walls, and then on the inside you have the little thickness portions, the very bottom. Make sure that you get your gun at an angle. So if this is the side wall of the body and this is the bottom, make sure when you're spraying the wall right here, you come out and then make sure you get a dust coat underneath that if you can, and try to get that adhesion promoter to wrap all the way around, because you're going to want some of that paint to bleed off to the inside so you get a good seal all around the body. I would apply 2 coats of Bulldog plastic adhesion promoter before priming, and you want to wait about 5 minutes in between coats, and then you must prime within 10 minutes of the application. So this is a pretty fast process. This is why I have multiple guns. So you're laying down the Bulldog, you need to be ready to, again, this is why I go back to the D-cup system that I mentioned. in the first video, because those D cups allow for rapid cleaning and rapid turnaround. You could already have your primer mixed, ready to roll. You undo the D cup that had the Bulldog adhesion promoter in it. You squirt a little acetone in the top of your gun, and then run that out, put your hand on it, get it to backsplash up through there, then put your primer on there and go ahead and start priming. And that's the best way to turn around. If you wait longer than 10 minutes, you're going to have to reapply the Bulldog. And the shit's not cheap. It's over about $130 a gallon, and you don't mix it with anything. So a gallon is a gallon, and it goes quick. Epoxies. So the one that I fancied for doing pretty much most general paint work was the EPX 908 or 901 through PPG. You can get it in black, gray, or white. It's an epoxy primer. It uses a 1-to-1 mix of primer and catalyst. So a 1-gallon kit, which usually runs about, I think, $130 with the primer and the catalyst. The 1-gallon kit actually makes 2 gallons. The stuff is invaluable. I mean, you have to have this stuff in your shop. Epoxy primer is basically a sealer used before painting. So if you have a perfect substrate, you can go ahead and just seal it off and then go ahead and paint. Mix the desired amount in a mixing cup, stir it, strain it, and then load it into your D cup, and it's ready to roll. It depends on what you're painting with. So it's good to have a couple of different ones, because the catalyst will work in each of them, whether it's black, gray, or white. It uses the same catalyst. So if you're going to be doing a job that would benefit from black primer or a black sealer, so say like blacks, if you're doing a black top coat or a metallic black top coat or a really dark gray, a black primer is going to help with painting and help minimize your paint usage. Whereas if you're doing like a gunmetal or maybe some off-whites or some dark blues, maybe a gray epoxy-based primer will work better for that. And then there's also white. So if you're going to be shooting white paints, having a white epoxy primer is going to be best, because if you use black primer and put a white base coat over the top of it, you're going to be pissing away your money faster than you know it. Because the white is so thin, it's just going to take multiple coats to actually get it to lay down in an even fashion, to where you won't see that black primer coming up through the bottom. So I kind of select the color of sealers based on the type of base coat that I'm going to be putting on. Gray high build primers. High build primer is used for filling light surface scratches. It's mixed usually in about a 4 to 1-to-1 ratio. So you have 4 parts of the high build primer. You're going to have 1 part of catalyst or hardener, and then you can also do 1 part of reducer to help it just spray through your gun. The stuff is really thick, as in the name of high build. You can also do 4 parts of primer to 1 part of hardener and 1 part reducer as well. You don't have to do 1 part reducer, but look at what it says on the can and do not exceed what it says on the can, and use the recommended hardeners that it tells you to use with that product to save yourself any trouble. For some plastics, a flex additive can be used in the high build primer to prevent cracking, but most of the time your flex additive is going to go into your clear coats. I have seen people use flex additive on really flexible stuff before. I've seen them use it in the primer, paint, and in the clear coat, but just know that the flex additive, it's really expensive. It can run up to $80 for a small pint and bottle. And not only that, it really only works with clear coat, because it's designed that once the clear coat hardens, it can be put into place, and as the clear coat cures, it cures too. Any flexing beyond that would actually cause issues down the road. But just know that you sometimes can put it in there. I don't recommend it. It just depends on the job. Just go with your gut. If you think you need a little flex additive in there, just put a tiny little drop. Not much. A little bit goes a long way. All primers are shot with a 1.8 tip. So your DeVilbiss starting line primer gun is going to be set up just for doing primer. I recommend that you have a gun only used to shoot primer and sealer. Period. End of story. Do not use anything else. Do not use a paint gun to shoot primer, because a paint gun has a different tip. And of course, when you're shooting the primer, you want to have about 35 to 42 psi, and then you want to have your fluid adjustment pretty much fully open. And of course, you want to use a test paper in your booth to fine tune that adjustment between your fan and your fluid flow. You don't want to have bulging edges with fine mist in between. You want to have a nice even coat on your paper before you start painting your actual substrate. Maintain about 8 to 10 inches from the surface. It's best to use about 50% overlaps and then combined with a consistent travel speed as well. So about a 50% overlap you want to use while priming, in a nice fluid consistent motion and a consistent travel speed. And you can adjust that. The further you come out, the slower you're going to have to get. The closer you get to the substrate, the faster you're going to have to move. And of course, you can also control that on the gun. So it's something that builds over time, but you'll get the hang of it the more you do it. For a high build primer, spot priming may be necessary over fine scratches to fill the areas, which is okay. It's just going to add to your sanding work once it's done. And of course, when you're doing high build primer, it's best to wet sand high build primer after it's cured. Wet sanding is it's the way to go. If you're using an EPX series primer from PPG, you can base coat within 30 minutes to about 1 hour if the temperature is above 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Recoat time on the EPX series primers or primer sealers are about 6 hours, and it must be scuffed after 24 hours before applying any type of top coat or base coat or paint. If FOD contamination occurs, it's best to wait 24 hours before attempting to wet sand the contamination out or scuff the contamination. And now what we're going to do, we're going to go do a short video of me actually priming. And so you can kind of see, I believe in this video, I'm shooting a gray primer onto a golf cart body, or this might be an actual sealer. High build primer must be wet sanded prior to the application of the base coat. So after the application of the last coat of your high build primer, use 400 to 600 grit to achieve proper substrate preparation for the paint. Recoat time is about 15 minutes in between coats. It does tend to dry very quickly, but it's best to wait probably about 4 to 6 hours prior to actually doing any type of serious sanding work or wet sanding on the high build primer. And I would recommend after you get the high build primer on, if you really want to take good care of your work and you're a good steward and you pride your work, I would probably go over the top of it with a sealer just to seal it out and have that ideal substrate for paint to stick to. Now, a little bit of a helpful tip. I don't know if professionals would recommend this or not, but I've been doing it for a long time. If you're doing extensive repair work, you can mix a small amount of base coat into a high build primer. Obviously, your stronger colors like reds, blues, or you can mix red and blue together and make a purple. You can mix that into the gray primer to make a colored primer. You would first apply the base coat of gray high build primer. You would then come over the top with a colored primer and then go over that again with a gray primer. Because what's going to happen is when you start wet sanding, you're going to knock off that first coat of that gray high build primer and you're going to get down to the color primer. And that color primer is going to be one layer. And if you bust through that layer, you're going to start creating uneven spots. So it can kind of be used as an indicator to tell you how much or how little to sand in certain areas when trying to do certain repairs or make something completely level. Just a little trick that body people use. But it's best to, if you're going to do an extensive wet sanding work with high build primer, do 3 coats of it and keep a middle coat a colored base coat. Or you could use, whatever color you want to mix. I've always gone with reds or blues or purples to try and get that really strong color to bleed through that gray. And it really helps you keep an eye on where you're sanding. So if you start to dig too much, you can kind of feather that out and blend that area. Wet sanding is a less of an aggressive form of sanding and is highly recommended when using high build primers. Now, there's nothing to stop you from taking your DA and knocking that high build primer with a 400 grit sanding pad on your DA and dry sand it. You can do that all day long, but just know that you're going to leave sanding marks in that high build primer. Using a media pad, obviously, if you're going to use a DA, is recommended. And a media pad is just a Velcro or stick-on attachment that is soft, that allows it to conform to small curves when going over the top of it. So instead of having a hard pad on a curved surface, you have a soft pad that conforms to the curved surface. It doesn't have a tendency to leave flat sanding marks near as bad as not having that buffer pad or a media pad on the DA. And of course, the DA can be used to speed up the process. So you can wet sand with your DA sander if you need to speed up the process, or if you're trying to get the job in and out quick. When you're mixing up a wet sanding lubricant, I like to use a quart of water with a good healthy amount of Dawn dish soap as the base for sanding. It gets sudsy, it's slick, and it foams up, but it also is a good carrier to help just lubricate everything as you're sanding. So, for example, if I had like a half-gallon mixing pail, I would fill that up with water, but in the bottom, I'd probably put about 3 or 4 ounces of Dawn, or just till I get a nice color change of the water. And that's a great carrier, but it's going to get messy, and you're going to go through a lot of Dawn. So, just use your head, and whatever works good for you works. You just need to have some type of a soap in there to help lubricate the water. Some people just use water, but I've always liked using soap. Once you have completed the wet sanding, a gray creamy base is left behind. You must wash off all this residue. To do this, either washing with water and a microfiber towel is best for small objects, or wipe off with a beach towel until the residue is gone. Sometimes if you're doing like a whole hood or a topper or a golf cart, you just roll it outside, spray it off with the hose, give it a good wipe down with a microfiber rag, like basically wash it, hand wash it. That usually works best, but you want to get that gray residue that's left behind off of there before going any further with painting. Of course, dry the body out, air dry it, what have you, and then hit it with some wipeout cleaner. Once all the sanding residue is gone and the substrate is dry, of course, again, apply the wipeout cleaner and tack rags to the surface. At this point, a base coat can be applied, but of course, again, I can't emphasize it enough, it's best that you apply an epoxy-based primer sealer before the application of the base coat. Now we're on to painting. It's best to paint in the same manner as you would prime. Use the base coat gun, which is going to have the 1.3 tip, run at about 35 to 42 psi with about 25 to 50% overlaps. Metallics must be sprayed at a consistent psi and pattern. So keep that in mind when you're doing large objects with metallics, because you can get yourself into a lot of trouble, especially when you're having to reach over something that's twice the size as you are, like a truck topper. You can get into some trouble and you can leave some lines in there. So it's best to keep that 25 to 50% overlap. It's best to keep the same height, and it's also best to keep the same PSI. When you mix your brand new can of paint, if you order it from the body shop, whatever color you order, they're going to bring you a can of paint. Now, I had a mixing system that I ran that, I press a button and it automatically mixes everything on the shelf for me. Most of the time, your colors run in quart cans. And if you have a mixing system that you mix at your shop with the weight scale and everything like that, that's great. My only problem with that is it generates a lot of waste, and it's cheaper in the long run over time. And if you do high amounts of volume, half the time they'll even bring them in. They'll get you a mixing system. But for most of you that are going to be out there in the industry, you're not going to be doing enough volume to actually justify your own full line paint mixing system where you can mix any color in an automotive book. So the reason I have the mixing system is to keep the paints that I need on the shelf mixed throughout the day. And that helps preserve the life of them. Now, little caveat to this. So instead of mixing my own paints, what I did is I would order my paints through my body shop supplier, and they would mix a pint of undiluted paint into a quart can. The quart can would come in, and of course, all these were standard colors that I used with all my Hydrographics films. I would add a pint of reducer on top of it, put my mixing lid on, put it on the shelf, and let it mix up. And that way, I already had pre-reduced paint on the shelf that I could add to my decup system at any time. And then any excess runover, instead of having a million cans laying around my shop, any excess runover, I could simply pour back into the can. That worked out very well for me. You might want to consider setting yourself up on that type of a system, especially if you have all these different patterns in stock. If you're dealing with licensed patterns like Mossy Oak, you have to have specific colors by Mossy Oak. Most of the patterns for TWN, I have my local vendor match the base coat colors with them, and that way I can keep my paint business local. Also, when you're doing custom jobs, like if you need to match a base color of someone's vehicle for their interior dash, you can get that pint of paint, or you can get a quart of paint and then break it up into 2 cans, or at least half mix 1 can and leave the other one undiluted. But that way you have that color there and it's always ready to go. That's just how I did mine. Most people don't do that in the industry because they mix up what they need for the job, they spray it on, and then they have very little to none left, and they give whatever little bits left to the vehicle owner as touch-up paint. So keep that in mind. But if you're going to use PPG paints, which I highly recommend, they're shop lines for Hydrographics, they're a 1-to-1 mix. It's your best value. 1-to-1 means so 1 part of paint to 1 part of reducer. When you start jumping into Matrix brand paints run anywhere from 1-to-1 to 2-to-1. So that means it takes 2 parts paint to 1 part reducer. So let me explain how this works. So if you get a 2-to-1 paint and you order a pint of it for $80, you're only going to get a half pint of reducer on top of that, and you're going to end up with 3/4 of a quart for $80. With PPG shop line, you're going to get that same pint, but it's going to mix up with a whole nother pint of reducer, and you might pay that same $80 or you might pay $70. It just depends on what pricing structure they have you on. But you're going to actually end up with a full quart, so there's better value in that. So the higher the mix ratios get from 1-to-1, the less paint that you're actually getting for more money. Just keep that in mind. House of Color paints. So if you're going to do any candy colors and stuff like that, your House of Colors are going to run 2-to-1 as well. And House of Color paints are not cheap because they are a multi-stage between base coat, candy, and clear. They're usually 3-stage paints. And each stage is going to cost you big bucks. Just getting 2 quarts of candies or 2 different candy colors, it's going to run you about $400. They're really expensive. On the mixing, the above denotes ratio of paint to reducer. Reducer comes in fast, medium, and slow. Medium is best for the southern area. So now we're at a point I want to go to this next video that shows me doing just a 2-stage paint on a Harley Davidson bike fender and a couple of other components that are in the shop. This is a custom color that I had mixed up at the time. It's a mixture of pinks, various pink pearl tones, and a slew of other stuff. I don't know how I mixed it. I just come up with this custom color, and I liked it. It looked pretty sick on the bike that we did Hydrographics on. But you're going to see the actual painting and how fast I move and everything like that, so you kind of develop your own idea of what this should look like, the distance, all that fun stuff.